Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Joe again. I'm a teacher, former examiner, and tutor at Edge Kingdom Glen Waverley. Today, as well as just touching on a quick recap of what we've looked at before, we want to today look at the poems that actually name individuals rather than animals. And also, as part of that, how we're going to start to think about planning essays. As always, I value my privacy, so unless you actually are one of my tutees, you're getting taught by a dog. I wanted to start briefly today with Starfish, just because you'll notice this consistent spacing the whole way down. And I've said before that her poems are visual, as well as literal in their experience that they're presenting to us. Have a look at the language here that indicates a sense of moving downwards. So that's the sort of thing I've mentioned before that you might want to look out for when you're looking through some of her poetry. I may also want to just briefly point out to you, how come I'm not talking too much about Wild Geese? Well, it's such a famous poem. I would much prefer actually to simply point to it as a form of comparison, particularly in these early videos, where I'm just assuming that most of your teachers will launch into Wild Geese fairly early on. We'll have a very definite interpretation of it. My suspicion is that I'd be advising a lot of my tutees to think very carefully about how they deal with wild geese in essay planning, rather than looking for any spectacular insights or quotes that really aren't there in this poem. It's so well known. It's also quite reflective of what we've talked about before. The use of pronouns is nothing we haven't seen before. The sense of establishing a reader between speaker and listener we've seen before. The focus on nature as a form of solace. This sense of not conforming to outside judgments, but finding a sense of nobility in yourself, even if you are lonely. And the value she places on imagination sometimes. We've seen a lot of that before. In previous videos, in fact, I've invited you to start thinking about how other poems that she does starts to complicate that. We've looked at the way in which she deals with it in slightly more nuanced ways in Dogfish, but also the way she almost flips the idea in Acid. So let's leave all of those nature poems, all of those poems about inspiring or contemplating the self, to one side. Let's have a look instead at what might be described as her dedication poems, her biographical poems, or simply her human poems. There's two sets of poems that are dedicated to people, and we're going to talk about rage a little later on. I'm going to dedicate a video to that, partly because of the ways in which the study design has chosen to deal with it. Basically, the study design tells some schools, or all schools, that they don't have to teach it because it's so sensitive. I think that makes it hard to write an essay about it on the exam, because although we'll allow you not to write about it, we can't penalise you for that. It might make it difficult to make an entire point that we definitely do want to make. But those poems are for another day. They're in relation to her abusive father. All right, let's look at the other poems that are dedicated to people. It's a point that I'd like you to consider making is that Mary Oliver's poetry is not one-dimensional. And although any individual poem may not grasp the entirety of her message in the way that Wild Geese doesn't, a combination of poems do. This poem here about Robert Schumann, composer who, as the poem reveals, ended up losing his sanity. which is ironic in a tragic sense, because this really complicated line here suggests that the music itself is so intrinsically expressive, communicating to others, even though in a way he was making less and less sense himself until he lacked all sense at all. The contrast is something that leads to this really nice juxtaposition. Frightening and wonderful. Well, what's so wonderful about a madman? Well, I think, again, we've seen this before. I've mentioned to you before the idea that Mary Oliver is really interested in the concept of struggle, even though she only uses the word once in the collection of poems we're working with. That the human mind is capable of such variety is in itself wonderful. But the fact that it has an end point and the fact that it can so easily misfire is in itself frightening. Remember, we talked about in Acid, she refers to the imagination as, well, through the metaphor of wires. Yeah, that's really interesting. She doesn't use web, she doesn't use threads, she uses wire. Harsh, cold. We often associate that with constraining things, forming barriers. Really clever choice of language on her part. And in the end, this poem is about thinking. Not just the way in which Schumann's mind finds itself trapped in a prison of its own making. That's the metaphor of the poem, with the idea of roads. There are crossroads, of course, but the mind at some point, when under threat or finding complexity it cannot handle, will cling to the familiar. But it's also about the way in which she's thinking. Yeah? Hardly a day passes I don't think of him. Hardly a day passes I don't think of him. She doesn't do that a lot in her poems. She doesn't do that symmetry of language. So it's as much about her thinking as it is about him. I did want to say something about her poetic techniques here because they're a little interesting. They're a little different from what we've seen her do in some of her other poems. I want you just to have a look here. This is a colon here, a colon here, an M dash here, EM dash. By the way, the reason it's called an M dash is theoretically it's the same size as the letter M. Not entirely sure in this font. But also this exclamative. So, when I annotated this for myself, I wrote a single word next to it, and it's important that it's capitalized here. Romantic. What it reminded me of was a poet called Wordsworth, whose name you may be already familiar with, and isn't it a great name for a poet? For our purposes, we don't need to get too lost in the sense of what a romantic is, just to accept my claim that he is one. But he's 100 years behind Mary Oliver. And yet Mary Oliver, at least in this poem, is writing in his tradition. Let me show you one of his poems that does this. Notice any similarities? But have a look at that. I've had a quick look. As you can see, it's the only time she does it in her poetry. I think what I like about this poem is that it's intimate, that it doesn't rely so much on nature, well, at all, really. In fact, the only real reference to it is him scraping the dirt off his shoes at the end of the poem. His whole life in front of him. There's something quite poignant. And that was one of the other words I wrote next to it in my annotations. It's quite different from the others, though, isn't it? Even though it's tinged with sadness, it is a celebration of internal human ingenuity and creativity. You don't need trees or birds here. Music can come from within. The mind itself can flourish and diminish. And it shows, I guess, the fascination that she has, not just with the natural world, but with the internal human one. Now, can I ask you to have a look at the 2025 paper? I might say something about it in the next video. Have a go at it. Not in terms of allocating poems, just in terms of whether you can think of multiple ideas to address the topics.